Okay.
All right, can you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I think the main question I was asked is about the erosion in Canyon Creek. So the question I think that Catherine Plaisant came to me with was how active is the erosion and is this channel in need of restoration, and a lot of other questions. And I'm really addressing that first question, which is how is this channel changing with time? How much water does it receive? Is it transporting sediment out of there? And how is it, is it a stable system or an unstable system at this point in time? And okay, so I'm going to start off by just showing some morphology and geology of the area, and then go into the actual measurements that we made and some of the results that we've obtained from those measurements. So you guys know as quite well that the Canyon Creek receives runoff from storm sewer systems. I'll show you in a few minutes, which is getting runoff from this urbanized area that people live in that's along the headwaters of this creek system, so that upland parts of this system are currently suburbs, and most of the rest of the watershed is currently forested. The channels contain prominent head cuts. So the question is, you look at that and think, oh, that's a result of urban runoff. And first of all, I want to point out that probably isn't a result of urban runoff. We see these same kinds of head cuts over in Greenbelt Park. We see it in other reforested parts of Greenbelt. So this is probably an artifact left from the erosion during the agricultural era. So we're going to look at these, and with the measurements we make, determine whether they're actively eroding. We also want to make relationships between rainfall and runoff so that we can develop some predictive power and look at what would happen under land use change or changes in climate, particularly with increases in precipitation, which might occur. This diagram on your on the right there shows the longitudinal profile of the creek, and that's been obtained from starting up right at the watershed divide where the storm sewer comes out and following the channel all the way down as it heads towards Goddard Creek. You can see this big break and slope here at the head cut, but you can also see a flat part downstream and a steep part upstream. And if you look at the stream.
Sorry, should we be on the next slide? I'm still seeing the first slide.
You're still seeing the show. All right. We'll just start that over again. Thank you for alerting that. I don't know why it didn't. Is it advancing now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let me see if I can go backwards then.
See what we missed, yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know why it. Yeah.
Yeah, now it's not going backward. Oh, here we go. Now
There.
it's changing.
Is this the one you did
Okay.
not see?
Yes, we did not see.
Okay, so all my nice explanation with my little dots and everything wasn't very useful. Okay.
Nope.
So this is what I was talking about,
clear.
that the urbanization is the flat upland area. The forested area is all the other area down slope of it. And this major head cut feature that we see here, looks like it's a result of maybe urban runoff, because that's what's currently coming down the channel. I pointed out that if we look at the longitudinal profile, starting at the head cut, going all the way down the channel, we see that the upper part of the system is really steep, and then you get to the head cut and the gradient decreases pretty dramatically. You can also see at the head cut that there's actually a lot of soil deposited there, and that's over the clay. That clay is actually the bedrock locally. And so when we wander around lots of other watersheds and look at the morphology of the streams, I see this kind of discrimination between where active channels currently are. And then when I go to urban and agriculturally damaged watersheds, I find often that there's big erosive features here, or there's at this kind of break and slope. If I go to places that haven't had any agricultural or urban runoff or they've recovered from that, I often see that this break and slope here is actually a wetland, and it's the place where the channel begins because there's enough flow being concentrated at that area that you can actually generate overland flow, and channels are created by overland flow erosion. And overland flow is extremely rare in forested ecosystems because the infiltration rates are so high. You'll see some of that shortly. The slower diagram just shows a geomorphological parameter, which we call slope steepness index. And here it's also demarking between what probably was the channel with a lower gradient and the really steep part that was originally hill slope that was probably unchannelized in the past. But I can't, I'm not going to talk about these geomorphic measurements as much as go through and talk about the infiltration measurements that we've made. Catherine took me to some other sites. I had previously taken her to Greenbelt Park, where we see a feature that almost looks like this, except for it has no. What? Say it again.
No, I think it's a mistake.
Is that background noise?
What? You got your
Okay,
thing. I didn't want
I
to
went
change that.
backwards on
Oh, yes.
purpose. Yeah. Okay, so if you go to Greenbelt Park, you can see.
I got two. The first one just says Council M instead of council member.
Could we,
That sounds like Amy. Amy, can you mute yourself?
Sorry, I thought I was.
Okay, no problem.
thank you.
All right, I thought someone was asking a question. All right, so the point I'm trying to make here is we see heavily eroded head cuts in other places, and they can recover in the sense that they stop being actively eroded. And here you see trees growing up in these old gully features, etc. And they're all over the landscape. We even call them ghost channels, etc.
Yeah.
The other
Actually,
thing
if I could, if
Yeah.
I could note that,
I call
those
them
gullies-
fossil gullies, but yeah, and you can see them in Greenbelt just around the corner from where this active channel is. Okay, so now we're pulling out a little bit. This is the stream gully of concern, the little headwater basin here. This is kind of flat uplands where everybody's homes are built, but geologically, it's a gravel and sand cap that's sitting on top of the red clays that you see exposed in the stream bed. So two different types of geologic materials. There's some other sand zones, and where the sand zones and the clay meet, you sometimes get these springs popping out. But this is, not a great geology for really building homes on, because you've got this shallow clay right underneath the surface. And you guys probably know that because hardly anybody or nobody has basements in Greenbelt because you're built on top of this clay. So what we did for this project was go out to this catchment. So here you can see a topographic map. Here's the stream, here's the head cut. In red here are all the storm sewer outlets. This is out. And here is the roads, Plateau Place. And this one over here is Laurel Hill. And what we did was to take parts of the hill slope, parts of the channel, and this area right above the head cut, which we're going to call the swale, and obtain sediment cores, soil cores. In the field, we measured soil infiltration rates. We installed stream gauges and measured channel morphology, and used the stream gauge data to determine flow depth, shear stress, and erosion during storms. And we're also developing relationships between measured discharge, which requires velocity measurements, and gauge height to be able to look at what the actual amount of runoff is. All right. So why did we measure infiltration rates? Well, infiltration is what changes the most when you change land use. And that causes a cascade of other processes. So you can see this photograph of Greenbelt here. Up on the top of the ridge is where the homes are. The storm sewer comes out here, and then the water comes trickling down the stream or raging down the stream, depending upon the magnitude of the storm. The hill slopes here are covered with trees, which unfortunately they're also covered with English ivy. And we hypothesized maybe the English ivy was not a very good thing for creating good organic rich soils, and maybe the infiltration capacity was being damaged by that. So these trees have been growing for 60 to 80 years there. A lot of soil recovery and particularly infiltration rates recover in that time period. So we measured infiltration by going out with single ring infiltrometer, which looked like open-ended coffee cans, and monitored the amount of water that would infiltrate over time. We plotted these as cumulative infiltration rates, and the slope of that relationship gives us the infiltration rate in centimeters per minute, and we convert that to centimeters per hour. So we're getting infiltration rate measurements from a lot of different sites. Here's what we call the swale, that area above the head cut. Unfortunately, it's also has a path going across it, which means it's trampled. Any trampled sites in the landscape tend to have relatively low infiltration capacities, and I'll show you that in a minute. But it also has lower organic contents, and because it had lower organic content, it could also not hold as much water, which it goes along with that. When we measured the infiltration rates for the different parts of the landscape, we looked at the hill slope, that swale I just showed you, and then the channel bed, in particular the channel bed, right next to the swale. Surprisingly, the channel bed had much higher infiltration rates than anything else did. And this is the only parts of the channel bed that have a significant alluvium. If you go to the channel bed, you'll see it's got gravel and other stuff on it, and water will just pour right through that gravel. It doesn't go very far if there's only a thin veneer of gravel and sand on top of clay. And so even though the infiltration rate might be locally high, there's a sort of a limited amount of infiltration that can occur in some places. At the swale above the head cup, however, that soil and the gravel on top of that soil is a couple of feet to a couple meters thick. So it's significant, we think. The hill slope also had fairly high infiltration capacities, about 10 centimeters, and sometimes 20 centimeters to 30 centimeters an hour. That swale where people have been walking along had less than 1 centimeter per hour as an average infiltration rate. It was pretty pathetic. So almost every place we measured, the infiltration rates were pretty high, except for those trampled areas. If we compare the infiltration rates we measured to the 1 hour storm rates, so this is how much precipitation falls in 1 hour. This is recurrence interval from a 1 in 10 year storm, a 1 in 100 year storm. So this is a probability analysis of those storm events. These are the data for the Beltsville Maryland gauge just down the road. And you can see that the 100-year storm, we would expect to have about 8 centimeters of precipitation in 1 hour with a 100-year storm. Even if the and magnitude of storms is increasing because of climate change, we might get that type of storm occurring on a 10-year recurrence interval instead of a 100-year. But you can see almost all the sites on the hill slopes, that channel bed that had higher infiltration rates than that, but the swale did not. So even though I hate the English ivy here, it's still is overlying a hill slope with trees and porous organic matter and everything else that's allowing for fairly high infiltrations rates, but not in this trampled area near the stream. So we looked at the precipitation throughout last year. We started this project in April. We did some measurements in March and April, and we installed some stream gauges in May. And then, of course, it almost immediately started to become relatively dry. And then we got some good storm events in late August, September, and October. The biggest events have been in January and February of this year. And I haven't actually downloaded the most recent storm events, but well, we're continuing the project. And we have yet to analyze those events. So what I'm going to show you next is the runoff that we've observed during those events. When you're out in the field during a storm event, you can see the runoff coming down the channel. The channel is not very well defined right above the swale, and the flow goes into the main creek. Because of those low infiltration capacities, you also get runoff from all those trampled areas that can go right into the creek, and that's where some of the erosion problems are. They're directly related to the low infiltration capacity. We're looking at the water coming down the stream next, not what's coming off the hill slopes, which is almost nothing coming off the hill slopes unless it's been trampled. And so we've installed 4 stream gauges in this system to monitor the flow depth, cross-sectional area of flow. And we also surveyed stream gradients to get the depth slope product, which is essentially the shear stress. I'll talk about that in a few minutes here. This is one of our gauges at site 2, and you can see our little Hobel data logger here. This is the channel, looks kind of mucky, and here's that red clay. So this is what I'm talking about. There's this little bit of soil and sediment sitting on top of that red clay, particularly in the tributaries where the slopes are steep and it's eroded almost down to the clay in some places. Other places, the sediment has been deposited to form gravel bars and little tiny floodplains inset into the channel. So as we head from those 2 tributary sites down to the tributary junction and then to that area above the swale, we're getting the tributaries are smaller, the sites 1 and 2, they come together to make this bigger channel, site 3 here. But then right above the swale, the channel has shallowed or shoaled, and it's a bit wider, but it's not very deep. It's almost half as deep as it was further upstream. So that means as this channel is coming downstream, it's depositing sediment, building up the bed, and spreading out the flow laterally. When we measure the longitudinal profiles, here's the bed profile. We had to do this with surveying. This is just showing the last 2 sites. So we did this up the channel and up the 2 tributaries, and the tributaries had the highest gradient. This main channel at the tributary junction had a lower gradient, and the lowest gradient was above the swale. Okay. So back to this precipitation events. I'm going to first show you the results of the spring storms and then the late summer storms. So the spring storms were pretty isolated events, but we had a couple of major storm events coming back to back. The first event gave us a total of about 3.5 centimeters of precipitation over a significant period of time. That caused a rise in the hydrographs at the 3 sites, the 2 tributaries and the main channel, or the tributary, the junction where the 2 tributaries come together, and then the red is that swale. So the first event, everything responded the same. The second event, the swale is the one that got the higher discharges. The other one drained. It was not as big of an event. And the reason for that is how close in time these 2 events occurred. The fact that it was spring and evapotranspiration wasn't really kicking in very high yet. And a lot of base flow kind of came into the stream as the water is coming out of the hill slope. The water that had infiltrated is coming out of the hill slope, and it's showing up in the channel here. And so the storage of the channel in the subsurface had been used up, and so this stream responded more dramatically. When we looked at the shear stress, and shear stress is the force per unit area acting on the bed. So this is the parameter that we use to determine whether or not the sediment is going to be transported. So the shear stress is essentially the density of the water, the acceleration due to gravity, the depth of the channel, and the gradient of the channel. So the depth of the channel is what we're monitoring with the stream gauges, and the slope is what we surveyed. So here you can see the shear stress increasing when it gets to the storm event, and then it drops again and increases. So it's following the depth profile for each of the sites, but because that swale had such a lower gradient than the tributary sites, the swale had a lower shear stress, which is why we see that deposition happening at the swale. When we looked at the later storms, they show pretty much the same thing. Precipitation events that were significant generated significant depths of flow. You can see a little bit of the main below junction is the deepest site here, and you can't see any data for the swale because it had relatively low flows compared to that. You can see the shear stresses as well, so they're kicking up into the 20s and 30s newtons per square meter with that storm event. And here we've separated about for the upper part and the lower part of the channel here. We also monitored some, I'm sorry about that. We also monitored some erosion events. Sorry about that. My computer is doing what it was doing earlier, just doing what it wants. All right. So you can see these big spikes coming from these shear stresses. So we next checked to see what was on the stream bed and whether the particles that were on the stream bed could be eroded by the force per unit area created by these storms. So here's the grain diameter of the particles that are on the bed at each of the gauge sites. This is the peak shear stress. So the data I just showed you, we just extracted the maximum flow depth and the maximum shear stress associated with that. This is the threshold shear stress. This is the theoretical value that's required to move that sediment. The 1-to-1 line is the dashed line. And you can see that the two downstream sites didn't experience shear stresses to cause significant erosion. Instead, we saw deposition at those sites as the sediment coming from upstream got deposited as the shear stress dropped as you went downstream. The two tributary sites did experience erosion. We saw that in the field, and the data tells us that, oh, they should have eroded given what their shear stresses were relative to the size of the particles on the bed. Now, the interesting thing here is the particles on the bed are not related to what is eroding from the channel. The channel is eroded into this Potomac group clay. The top of this system at one point was capped by sands and gravels of the Potomac group, and they are sands and quartz gravels. They are not these funny shales and other things, which look to me like basically what people used for road metal. So we see entire stream banks, entire gravel bars built out of this stuff. This stuff has been in the system for quite a long time. I think at one point there might have been gravel roads above at the watershed divide, and some of it was brought down then, or it was actually put in the channels to help stabilize the bed at some point. So if anybody knows where this material came from and who put it in the stream or how it got to the stream, that would be really interesting, because right now we're just tracking the movement of this material through the stream, but it is actually what's making a stable channel bed. Okay, so our next steps are also to take the measurements that we have of gauge height and cross-sectional area and develop rating curves, which are these relationships between discharge and gauge height that we can use to determine the relationship between how much it rains and how much runoff we get from the watershed. And also we're making relationships between the shear stress that we observed and the question we want to ask is whether in the future with bigger storms that we might have already caught or bigger storms that might occur, whether these two downstream sites become erosive as well. But so far the data don't seem to indicate erosion. We're continuing to get deposition at those downstream sites. Okay, so to summarize here, the infiltration measurements that we made indicated that the hill slope infiltration rate exceeded the rainfall rate for most storms. And we're not talking about 1,000-year storms or something like that, but the 100-year storm as currently analyzed it has a lower intensity than the infiltration capacity of the soil. So the soils will continue to infiltrate water with these big storms. The low infiltration rates that we measured were on the paths that had been trampled by people and probably deer walking around. The other low infiltration rates that are generating the runoff are all the streets and roadways. But if you think of it, there's so much of this watershed that has forest on it, and therefore compared to back when it was agricultural land, the agricultural land had higher infiltration capacity than streets and roads. But since much more of the watershed was in lower infiltration capacity materials being eroded agricultural soils, the overall runoff rate was probably actually higher in the past, and that's why these gullies were originally cut into this landscape. We've seen that the morphology of the channel changes as it goes downstream. The channel widens as the gradient decreases, the channel depth decreases, and above the head cut, there's a significant deposition during storm events as that shear stress also decreases downstream. We saw active erosion in the tributaries, but if you look at the tributaries, there's patches where the stream is eroded down to that clay, and other patches where there's active gravel bar deposition and floodplain formation. So there's an inset floodplain and inset stable channel forming down at the base of those little gullies there. And there's also significant deposition of sediment at that head cut. Right, so I'll end with that. Right. Anybody have any questions?
Brian, you had your hand up? You're muted, Brian.
Yeah. I was actually clapping, but if nobody else has
But
a
I like the
question yet.
silent clapping. That's my favorite.
Okay, so you're saying there is some active erosion localized in some of the smaller tributaries.
Yes,
So a question there, since some of those go up towards either the roads or
That's right.
houses, is that something that over a scale of decades or whatever might actually work its way up to those places?
well, we don't
Or-
see a very clear pattern that it's working its way headward at all. I mean, headward erosion is a pretty
Yeah.
common thing in stream channels in these types of gullies. But we see, we actually took a bunch of students this past summer and had them walk the entire length of the gullies and map out where they saw it eroded to bedrock, where they saw floodplains, what the width of the head of the channel was, or the width of the entire channel was. And where we saw that the banks had moved backwards, eroded backwards, that we're starting to get these little floodplains forming at the base. So those are sites of active deposition. So overall, even in the tributaries, we saw more length of the channel that was active deposition than was active erosion. And that's the best way I can express it too. And I'm not too disturbed by there being patches of erosion and deposition because, you know, that's a type of stability in a way, to create flat areas and steep areas, flat areas and steep areas. And the channel is full of those. The other thing that it's full of is flat areas that are defined by just a small tree that fell across the stream, or a log that got stuck next to another log, and then all the sediment built up behind that and flattened that little area. So there's a lot of little steps in the channel. The only problem is the channel is way down there. It's a deeply incised channel. But as I showed you at the beginning there, deeply incised channels can recover. You know, trees start growing up in them, and they could capture a lot of sediment with and leaves and organic matter with their roots and branches.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Nice
it's
and
more than
clear.
you asked for, I
Great
know, but yeah.
presentation. No, this is great.
Yeah.
So I have a question, mostly just to make sure that I understood the talk. That big head cut.
Yeah.
It's located where there is that change in slope.
Yeah,
And
like,
you expect that to be a pretty stable feature. It's not going to work its way upstream or anything like that. What should we expect from that, if anything?
well, I think it's hovering there on the edge, to tell you the truth. I think right now, because it's in that flat area, you have to basically start mobilizing the sediment in that flat area for it to really change. We can see in areas where where the flow has stopped in the channel. So in Greenbelt Park and places where no overland flow is coming into the channel from urban runoff, these things can just heal right up. So we know they can be shoved that direction. The question is whether the amount of runoff coming into the system has been turned back far enough that this stream is not going to erode headward. The fact that it has such a thick soil over the top of the head cut kind of suggests that it's not eroding back, but right now that sediment's depositing up there, it's getting thicker because it's a depositional area above the head cut. The big thing that I can't predict very well is, will the intensity of the storms generate such big flows in the future that you can actually trigger major head cut erosion at that location? Two things I don't know. One is what the shear stresses would be with big storms. Second, whether these, the most important thing is probably whether these big storms will occur and how much runoff would result from them. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't even know what magnitude storms to expect. So I've been working with people at the National Weather Service with and NOAA looking at the predictions with climate change of what we might expect to see for storms, but it's a big unknown right now. So I'm trying to predict what would happen for storms that we don't know exactly how big they will be in the future.
Okay, thanks.
Not very concrete answer, but yeah. I wish it was as simple as if that tree stayed in place, the gully would stay in place. But I've looked at a lot of these fossil features, and there's a lot of fossil features that don't have any trees or anything at their head cut there. So it doesn't seem to be a requirement for stability of the feature.
So I have a question about in the future, which I know nobody can totally predict, of course. If there are these larger storms like we have seen across the country in recent years.
And we've had them here. We've had them
yeah,
here.
we have had them here, and there has been some flooding in some areas of the urbanized area, as you call it, in Greenbelt. Would the flood danger increase? I mean, in the woods there, probably, right?
The flooding is going to come from the urban area, even with even if you increase the magnitude of the floods, a magnitude of the precipitation event, you are not going to exceed the infiltration capacity of most of the forest. And then there are these sites within the channel itself that have high infiltration capacity. What you'd have to do would be to envision a future where you're going to get back to back major storm events. So it's not only are you going to get one big event, but you'd have to have multiple of them in close proximity to one another. That would be the worst case scenario. But we had some major storms, let's see, July 10th, 2022, that hit this area. And that is about as, that was a significant event for a summer storm. That was a really major event caused flooding of roadways all over the area. I think it caused flooding in Greenbelt in some of the homes and in the roadways as well. But it didn't cause catastrophic erosion at the field site here.
Thank you.
I think the urban flooding, if I was going to if I lived in Greenbelt, I would kind of look at the existing urban infrastructure and some of the flooding that's already occurred with the storms. I think that might be more important than this particular channel feature in terms of whether it's going to be more susceptible to damage by floods or by intense storms.
Thank you for the answer. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I was gonna follow up on that, that July 22nd, or that July.
Yeah,
storm,
2022. Yeah.
That cost me $44,000.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. What happened?
We had to, our basement in Greenbelt.
Yeah.
It was an addition to a small, one of the original 10 houses.
Mhm.
The Porter family put an addition on the back of the house, and that is in clay. And it just flooded like.
There was no place for that water to go.
Right. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, so we spent $44,000 on what we hope was not even, the industry of reaction to those kind of storms has developed in the years. So 10
Yeah.
years ago, although we had sump pumps and stuff, that was the best quality of current ways
Yeah.
to deal with it. So I agree with you. Our real issue, just like you look next to the Sunoco station at the constant flooding of those 2 basement houses,
Yeah.
I would wonder if if we're looking for a why, or this is so important, would be for the do not continue to develop into this area because the water needs someplace to go.
Needs someplace to go. And it doesn't have much. That clay gives you a huge disadvantage because you only have so much storage capacity between wherever the wherever the ground surface is and the depth to that clay layer. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to drag some seismic or geophysical equipment across the terrain just to get the depth of the soil in these various locations at that site. But I can see in just the cut banks and with our auger holes that the soil depth is pretty considerable in lots of places in that basin axis.
So what I hear you say is nature is currently doing its job.
I think it is, and if you could back off the amount of runoff coming into the system, and this is where decisions need to be made that aren't easy, because somehow you need to get the water to go someplace. And if the storm events are going to get more intense, people clearly don't want it in their backyards and other places. The thing that's working to our advantage is that along with slightly increasing precipitation rates, we also have greatly increasing evapotranspiration rates, which means that if you can use the forest and the trees and everything else, most of the water is actually leaving the system, not by runoff, but actually by evapotranspiring through the vegetation. And you could possibly improve that at Greenbelt. I suspect that getting an understory vegetation that was something other than English ivy would actually enhance the evapotranspirative capacity of the forest in general. And maybe I'm just showing my hatred of English ivy here, but I do think that could be something that could. Then you keep everything drier, that between storm events it dries out faster because the forest is doing that work for you. I think trying to get Mother Nature to do the work for you, the heavy lifting of this. So we're doing analyses right now where we're taking, how much water is coming down, how much of that is leaving the system by evapotranspiration versus storm runoff versus base flow runoff in different parts of this part of Maryland and adjacent areas. And in urban areas, much more of it goes to urban stormwater runoff. But in urban areas, less of it goes into base flow runoff. Some of it goes to base flow, but a significant amount still goes to evapotranspiration. So if you could get that to do some more of the work for you, I think that would help, because otherwise you're looking at dumping water into streams to try to save the homes. But I think there's alternative answers. And that's what some of these, stormwater green types of features actually do, where you're storing it in a place where it can be evapotranspired. But there's a lot of places in Greenbelt to improve vegetation density cover and therefore increase evapotranspiration. There's a lot of places where the grass is really, really thin, or the soil is bare, and every time you look at that, you should go like, we need to put something there, because that would help both of those problems.
Well, that is Doug Telemay's, building parks in our homes, that
Yeah.
taking away lawns, the
Mhm.
European lawn, and replacing it with native plants and habitat.
I think that would make a huge difference. I did that with my parts of my yard where I put my yard into different kinds of plots. I live over in University Park, so I've got that clay right under the surface too. And I took the part of the yard that had the worst infiltration capacity and started and planted things, threw all my leaf litter on it, and I now have thick organic horizons and an infiltration capacity that exceeds all the other parts of the yard, which is just bizarre. And it only took me 30 years, but yeah. You could do it in 15. Yeah. Yeah. I think getting people to not pick up leaf litter, somehow changing people's ideas on raking leaves, I think would be a big, big improvement as well. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about so like, if the erosion
Yeah.
in the stream, if the water, the shear stress isn't enough to really be causing too much erosion, especially once below the head cut where the
Yeah.
slope is lower.
Yeah.
The next thing that I would think about is the quality of the water quality
Mhm.
entering the stream, and how, especially this time of year when there's salt in it,
Right.
and even in the summer when it's pulling all these other things off the roadway, is there, and then this flows into Beaver Dam Creek, which is actually one of the healthiest stream
Yeah.
systems in
Yeah.
the upper Anacostia River. So
Well,
at some point
yeah.
it becomes an idea of, do we
Yeah,
want to
that-
do something to improve the water quality?
Yeah, and that has to be done before it goes into the stream, pretty much. We with one of my graduate students and Margaret Palmer, and we monitored, I think, a bunch of RSCs to see whether they did a good job at improving water quality and whether they mitigated with the stormwater runoff. And they have to be really quite big to mitigate stormwater runoff in any significant way, as it turns out. Very few of them have been effective for, they decrease the number of small, moderate size events, but they do very little for the big events, which means you could take away a lot of trees from the landscape, install a feature like that, and end up with less evapotranspiration and not take the head off of those, or not really change the magnitude of those big events. The other thing is that if you get runoff that comes in and fills up a storage reservoir that's located near the stream, is just feeding bad water quality to the stream all the time. So the most important thing is to kind of get water of poor quality stored away from the stream, not near the stream, or not stored at all, or not created at all, or at least distributed in various ways. So having small places that are capturing water with pollution tolerant plants in them to help with evapotranspiration is probably your best bet on that. So that also suggests a distributed answer, not a focused answer. The other thing is to imagine what the landscape would be if some of the trees fell down, because if you go to Greenbelt Park, where there are these giant head cuts that are starting to fill in, the thing that really accelerates the healing of those landscapes is big trees falling in, because that starts to increase the rate at which that material is being stored and captured in that landscape. and you fill things in a lot faster when trees start to tipple over. I now know that sounds scary because everybody looks at the landscapes and say, oh, this will be a disaster when this tree falls over and this this steep bank slumps backwards. But that's actually the beginning of the next stage of basically evolution of these features. So if you prepare your thoughts on that, you would be less horrified when it does happen and realize that it should go on. So we should maybe make a photo archive of what these things look like as they go into these different stages.
Thank you.
Do you use the two terms, distributed something and something else?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So I talked about how can we decrease the amount of runoff coming into the stream, the head of the stream. And one way would be to, put it all in a pond somewhere, and there's no place to do that in Greenbelt, and ponds are out of favor anyway because they collect bad water, bad quality water, attract all the amphibians to come and die there basically. So we don't want to do that. But the other option would be to essentially have distributed stormwater management, where you've got small little places that are gathering stormwater or funneling it a little bit before it gets to be a big amount of stormwater. And then using evapotranspiration is the main way that you get the water out of there. So you're not storing it, you're going to give it to vegetation, is going to use it. And 75 to 80% of the water that falls as precipitation in this region is lost back to the atmosphere as evapotranspired water. So that is the main pathway that the natural system wants to use to get that water out of here. In this particular setting that you guys are in, the rates of groundwater recharge are really low because of that clay. And that means evapotranspiration, shallow soil flows and stream runoff are the main ways that the water is going to exit the system.
So I don't think anybody is keeping track of their hands up. So maybe I could do that. But Thomas, it was next.
Well, I had a question, what you had said about the trails nearby, because is rerouting the trails in that vicinity of the head cut?
Yeah.
Would that help?
I think that'd be great. And also, I'm just worried someone's going to fall in.
No, that's something we can take up with, because it's in GHI, but we can take it up with the Woodlands Committee about rerouting.
Yeah.
trails.
Yeah. I mean, there's that one trail that goes right over the top of the head cut. Possibly it's not causing a whole lot of damage because that's where there's a lot of deposition. And one of the things that we've been looking at, and Catherine, I think you've been looking at this, is every time I go out there, there seems to be new deposition right over the top of the head cut, which means you're making, even though people are trampling it, then a new pulse of sand comes in that maybe has a higher infiltration capacity again. But you won't really want to count on that happening to maintain the soil infiltration capacity above the head cut. So not trampling above the head cut probably would be a good idea.
Brian?
Good. Yeah, I was actually also going to ask about the trails. So I'll just point out that the Woodlands Committee actually did close one section of trail along the stream out of concern for safety. We weren't thinking about erosion infiltration. And further down in the forest preserve, there's an additional section where you basically have two trails paralleling each other, one right along the edge of the stream, because that's where people kind of naturally go.
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to look at that chasm. I mean, it's really fun to look at. I have to agree. Yeah.
Yeah, but actually current trail design ideas are much more not to follow the edge of the stream or lake, but to go out to it occasionally so people can see it, and where possible to put the trail up on slopes, side slopes, rather
than
the
trail
bottom areas.
Up and and have viewpoints. I agree. That would be
and there's some
much safer
trade-offs
for people. I'm worried about a little kid falling in there and getting badly hurt. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
those features are gonna slump and fail, and hopefully it won't fail when somebody's on them, but they might, you know?
yeah, this is very helpful as input and then to think through the trade-offs because setting up a new trail does mean, okay,
That's
you're
right.
gonna trample and
Trample
cut
new
some
places.
vegetation, but
Yeah.
it, it may be worth protecting the other areas and still come back to the concept, the trail itself is concentrating impacts rather than having them spread over a bigger area.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
so.
there's probably, it's gonna be hard to optimize, but it could be better than it is now. I think we all agree that it's definitely the case. It could be better than it is now.
Yeah, no, also along Grounded Branch, we already have plans and actually have already ended up starting to do some stuff to move the trail back.
Yeah.
Tom?
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure I understand correctly. It sounds like what you're saying is that the erosion at the head cut or the main channel is not a super big problem. And we should be looking at a more general, big picture, general green infrastructure solutions to handle runoff. Is that an accurate
Yeah,
summary?
right. I don't see, I mean, the head cut could be getting deeper. I didn't measure whether the plunge pool at the base of that head cut is getting deeper. But I don't see any evidence that that would cause a catastrophic failure. There are things that could cause catastrophic failures, which interestingly enough would be, I think the biggest thing that could is if you did a lot of engineering of placing boulders and stuff on relatively steep slopes and tried to even if tried to create sort of step pool kind of feature with big boulders and other heavy things. And the reason I suggest that is then you're going to store water between storm events, but you're still storing it above that clay layer, which is basically going to give you high pore water pressures. You have to be careful that you don't have the steep slope the slope steep enough and the soil depth high enough and the pore water pressure high enough that you just create a landslide. And I think that's a possibility in this location. So I'd be very, very cautious of any stream restoration designs without actually calculating for landslide hazards, which have happened with some of these headwater stream restorations in the past. They're not discussed very much, but they are catastrophic when they happen. You don't want that. So I think staying away from that kind of feature is probably a good idea for this region.
And when you say catastrophic, in what sense do you mean that?
A major landslide. So
which would damage the ecology of the or people.
The example that I'm thinking of, which was happened in Anne Arundel County, was they put in an RSC, one of those step pool kind of features on a relatively steep slope with giant boulders and stuff. And then a storm occurred. The pore water pressures with the soil rose high enough to offset the frictional resistance of that material sitting on there, and it just failed as a landslide along that kind of fill underlying material interface. And the material there wasn't quite as bad as the stuff there. That was the Nanjemoy Formation, which has a permeability that's higher than the clays that underlie this. But that clay at depth makes it really hard to put anything on this surface. It's hard to build anything on top of a clay foundation is basically what I'm saying. And in Greenbelt, most of the homes, etc., are built on that clay foundation, but they're flat. They're on the flat parts of Greenbelt. No one's building on the really steep hills for a reason. They don't want their houses and everything else to slide down those hills.
So, but by catastrophic, it's catastrophic to the stream and the ecology of the area. Is that what you mean?
No, it would be a catastrophic failure, which is just a landslide. But would it be catastrophic? No, it would be that you would invest a lot of money doing a stream restoration and then it fails.
I got you.
It's just a waste. Yeah, don't do it. Yeah, and then it'd be a series of, if you do a stream restoration, like an RSC that then requires that you take a lot of the forest away. You've lost the forest. You've put in the feature which could possibly fail during an extreme event if it's on a steep slope, underlain by the clay. It's a very difficult thing to get right if you're going to do something like that. And so I would caution to stay away from it for that reason.
Thank you. I understand now. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had one other question because I was familiar. I used to teach geology at Northern Virginia Community College. We would go to Great Falls to talk about the
Yeah.
story of the headwater erosion due
Yeah.
to the fluctuating sea level during
Yeah.
ice ages. But how you're saying this headwater erosion was due to the agricultural runoff?
Yes, yes, it
And
was.
so,
It's basically due to the change in the infiltration capacity.
Hi, nice to meet you, gal. I love you, baby. You look
Uh-oh.
nice.
Could somebody remove
Kevin,
this
can you
person?
kick this person out?
This
No,
guy's been
I'm
here
like-
before. So,
I love
bye-bye.
okay.
Okay,
I was just wondering about the relative magnitudes of those two.
yeah, yeah, the Nick Point migration caused by the drop in sea level, and isostatic adjustment is a big thing. It gives us Great Falls. It gives us the falls we see on Northwest Branch. That happened in this area as well, but it already transgressed beyond the area that we're in. You're basically downstream of that. That wave of erosion
Oh, right. Okay.
is passed and actually changed watershed boundaries in this area, etc.
Okay, so that shift happened before, and now then the agricultural stuff.
Yeah, and then the agricultural erosion was just because the infiltration capacities were exceeded everywhere. Well, not everywhere, in a lot of places during major storm events. And so you get gullies that went up to like within 30 feet of the drainage divide, which is probably why in the urban area they put the storm sewer outlets in those gullies. So essentially people were making the decision that that was where the storm sewer outlet should be because there was a channel feature there. That channel feature was an artifact of that agricultural erosion era. And then it got hardened into that landscape by receiving that overland flow runoff from the urban areas. So we're kind of, taking our first mistake and adding a second one to it. Yeah.
Catherine?
But unless some people might still come up with some other questions, but then I'm wondering if I know you're gonna continue collecting some of the data from the sensor. Or can you talk a little bit about what you think you're gonna do next?
The gauges are still out there happily collecting data for us, yay. And like I said, all the biggest storm events have occurred this winter. Remember last winter, we didn't get very many big storm events at all. And so we started the summer period in really dry conditions. So we might actually start this summer with higher, base flow, higher amounts of storage, which might change things a little bit. So it'd be nice to compare or to monitor what's happened in December or January, February. So I'll be downloading those data shortly and analyzing those. And then also I'd like to develop the relationships between the gauge height and the discharge so we can actually get the rainfall runoff and we can see how much of the precipitation is actually leaving the watershed as runoff. And then we know what we're trying to do with any stormwater retention or any other things. Once we get to that point, we can compare it to models better. But right now we're just basing what we see off of the field-based measurements, which is important because usually people just model it, and if they get the models wrong by an order of magnitude or something, you never know.
And so maybe a second part of the question is that first of all, thank you so much for taking on this project and trying to answer some of the questions many of us had. But I'm wondering, so is it really something that is particularly interesting for you? Like what is, we'll be very proud also if the Canyon Creek was really special and interesting? Is it something that somebody might write a paper about?
Oh, yeah, we're gonna write a paper about it.
All right.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're doing is comparing it to lots of these other features like a Greenbelt Park, and this is in the coastal plain. We see headwater gullies in the Piedmont, you know, where the rocks are very different, and there they often have deeper soils. And then those soils have eroded more quickly, but they also have larger particle size sort of naturally. So the response of the systems are quite different in the two areas. And so that really suggests that when we come up with restoration designs, they kind of be specific to what's actually happening in the area, both what the past history was and also the capacity of the system to adjust to these changes. Which brings me back to, where did that gravel in the system come from?
Yeah.
Does anybody know?
Does anyone know? Otherwise, I was gonna like ask GHI, start trying to do some archival research there.
Someone's
So,
got their
um,
hand up.
I don't know.
Yeah, hi,
There's evidence of a road, and there's some equipment all the way down, almost near the fence.
The dog fence.
So it kind of, that area has more of a shape of a roadway than a trail, and
Yeah,
it's currently a trail, but it is wider, and then there's some part, I don't know what equipment it is, but it's all
you
the
know,
way back there.
looking at the gravel road that kind of heads to where you guys store all those down trees, etc. That looks like the same sort of stuff, and it makes me think that you know, when they first built the community of Greenbelt, it probably had gravel roads everywhere.
so I have some information
Oh, you
on
do?
that.
Oh, cool.
All right.
For the original town, which was not up that way,
Right.
they were paved roads to start with.
Okay.
It does appear though that when they built what we call the defense homes, which that area is all part of the defense frame homes, it appears that the first 2 or 3 years they were gravel roads, and that they got money in 1944, 45 to pave the roads. That's from news reports, and they're a little sketchy. I haven't had a chance to go over to archives and actually dig in and see if we can find more information about that. But and the originally there was a country lane that was parallel to Ridge Road, but right up on the watershed divide. So, that about where there's that interior path between Ridge and Hillside, Laurel Hill. And but that would have been right up along the divide. So it's kind of interesting what you were saying about, that outfall having been placed in what might have been a gully there, where Ridge is now. But yeah, that was just 2 or 3 years. So I think, like what Damien was mentioning, there could have been other events involved. But
yeah, and also remember the construction phase. Everything was built before sediment fences and all that stuff was required. Not that they work all that great even now, but we've all seen. Well, I don't know if you've ever looked at logging areas with gravel roads in them that are just eroded to beat the band, and that gravel is down in the stream beds very quickly. So even if there's just one road going through an area, that gravel road then is the source of sediment. If you go to logging areas in Pacific Northwest, most of the sediment in the stream comes from the gravel road. It's a big deal. So it wouldn't have to be there for that long for there to be this big pulse of stuff into the stream that then sort of cruises down the stream over time. I don't know if that explains the gravel in the stream, but it sure looks like road metal to me. Yeah.
Karen, you had your hand up longest.
Yeah. I was wondering if there was any like water quality sampling that was involved in this, or if it's all about stream hydrology.
We have a little bit of water quality sampling. All I monitored was the conductivity, and unfortunately I left those at home, so I wasn't able to. I'm still at work, unfortunately, so I wasn't able to put that in.
Yeah, I guess I've been going out with Catherine recently, and like one of the main things I do in my research group is water quality. So if that would be useful, like to measure, like I have a discrete analyzer that can just like measure nutrient concentration and stuff. So if that would be like a useful addition.
Yeah,
it
is
wouldn't-
somebody monitoring it on an ongoing basis?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I measure a lot of water quality for some of my other projects. To have it be useful, you have to measure it, you know, sort of on an ongoing basis enough that you can either develop relationships between water quality and seasonality, or water quality and discharge plus seasonality. And that becomes a big endeavor. But it could be that you say, well, we already know what would give us the worst water quality. It's going to be either well, there's not much flow in the stream at base flow. It's not producing much runoff. It does at low flow at all. It just it's going off as evapotranspiration, where it completely dried up last summer for a huge part of the summer. So you could go out right after people had salted the roads and say, what's the worst case that we're dumping into the stream? But the question is, what do you want to know the water quality for? To make decisions on how to better manage the water?
Yeah, I guess it's like if people were concerned about the you know, about the storm runoff, not just because of the potential for erosion, but because of like water quality impacts from that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, what comes off there does get stored in that wetland downstream, and then that feeds more slowly into Beaver Dam Creek. So, yeah, it's an issue, probably. I think without road salting, if that's minimized, it's less of an issue, I suspect.
Okay, thanks.
You're muted.
Thank you. We're out with Karen Lee a couple of days ago. We noticed an algae bloom in the creek right now. So
okay.
I'm just, you know, we're curious. So actually, right an hour ago, about 2 hours ago, I went to collect some samples to see if maybe Karen could analyze them, or is that an indication of something particular? Is it related to the salt?
When you say algae bloom, what do you mean?
It was like this kind of filamentous, like fairly bright green algae that was growing on the rocks and like hard surfaces in the stream.
I took a bunch of photos, but found not very good.
So it's growing mainly on the rocks. It actually sounds like a spring diatom bloom.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know how to like I wasn't really able to identify it, but I guess if Catherine took pictures, she could send them to you.
Do you have a microscope? Can you stick it under a microscope?
I do.
Diatoms are very distinctive, but the spring diatom bloom is the base of the food chain in a lot of streams. So just because you see algae doesn't necessarily mean something bad, because in the spring, the forest canopy isn't getting in the way of the stream, so the sunlight gets down to the stream better, and the sunlight and the warm temperatures can generate, and the leaf litter in the stream can generate a stream, the spring diatom bloom, and that's got nothing to do with pollution. That's a natural seasonal cycle in rivers, and that's the kind of net productivity that's generating the food for the river.
Yeah, like how high of like magnification do you need to see it, do you think? Because I don't know, I have like my daughter's, like we got her, you know, like a home microscope.
Oh yeah, that probably would work. You can see diatoms. You can see
I have a really strong one at
diatoms.
work.
Yeah, and they got beautiful shells. You know, Google diatoms, and they're these silica shells that are made by these little tiny plants, plankton basically, but they actually attach themselves to rocks, and that's why the rocks are so slippery in the spring. Yeah, and then they die back because the diatoms are also coming from you know, a lot silicic acid is coming into the stream, usually in the spring as well, because the water tables are higher and it's releasing stuff from the groundwater system into the stream.
Well, yeah, Catherine, if you want to if you want to get together for the weekend, I can bring over the educational microscope. We have a powerful one at work too, but
yeah. And I have one that was donated to us for the benthic survey, actually.
Oh, good. Yeah, you should be able to see. Yeah, just scrape it off, stick it on a microscope slide, which you probably have, and just look at it. Yeah,
right.
They're beautiful.
And if I could say a few words about that, we did some of that too. Like we got a team of volunteers from the neighborhood to do a benthic survey. We first did one first to kind of learn how to do it.
Right.
Didn't do very well, and then the second one we had somebody who had more experience helping us and the microscope. So we did better, and actually.
And what did you find in the way of benthic organisms?
So it's in the slide I sent you. If,
say it again.
Unless I could, it's in the slides I had sent you, but I could probably pull it out. But the thing I remember is we used a tool that was measuring and compare and allowed us to compare to other stream. So all the other local stream are rated as poor, and ours was fair. You know.
Yeah. You had caddisflies and stoneflies.
Right.
Yeah, which is, not trivial for a tiny little creek. I mean, keep in mind that this little creek, barely is a creek. You're at the headwaters of a tiny little system, and it's lost what would have been sort of naturally in the system. Remember, I was talking earlier on about that originally these tiny little streams began in wetlands, and then the wetlands got eroded in the agricultural era. So not beginning in a wetland puts the whole creek at a disadvantage compared to its original setting, because that would have given it organic matter and leaf litter and all the food for the stoneflies and the caddisflies would really have liked to have had that stuff around. Yeah.
But we found some. We even found a salamander. The young version of the salamander.
Yeah, and that would have really liked that headwater wetlands. That was their native habitat in this area, or those headwater wetlands, which now is the one that probably was once at the location of the big hole is no longer there, but there's a wetland downstream that essentially is compensating for it a little bit, maybe. Yeah.
Ryan?
Yeah, I guess to ask, the Forest Preserve has other tracks, including just to the south of Northway Road and also by the high school and behind the shopping center and so on. So in terms of understanding what you're finding in Canyon Creek, are there some things to be aware of that might make those other areas different or need to be considered?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of things that I could measure that could be put in as part of the database I'm collecting on these other streams. And I probably should go and look at those other streams just to see how they fit along a kind of geomorphic continuum here. Yeah. I think some of them are already kind of healed agricultural areas, which is what they the one that I went to the south of Canyon Creek with Catherine a while back that we looked at, and that one seems to be recovering just fine. It was once probably a heavily eroded gully like this was, and now it's back to being a forest with some weird looking features on its forest floor.
Okay, if I can go ahead and add another question from what you just said and saying before, I'm hearing a bunch of things to me sounds like would support people putting in little rain gardens in their backyards or in common areas and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Beth?
I have three little things. One, first of all, this is fascinating. It was such a great discussion, and I love geology, but I'm by no means an expert, and I understood everything you said. You did a great job. It was very interesting. And like, I can think of this for many years as I work on things in my own life and yard and around the way in Greenbelt. So thank you for that. Two, I mean, we all know that Greenbelt dumps gravel along Northway Road. And so maybe we should talk about the overall implications of that based on a little bit of this study. And then three, just in case you have students who are interested, our school in Landover backs up to the Cattdale branch, which is part of the Lower Beaver Dam Creek. So if you have any interest in sending your students out there, I could send my middle schoolers out there also with them to learn about some of this kind of work that you guys do. We already have a project going with Dr. Amy Green on the Piscataway Indians, and we are part of that land over there in Landover, but we also have, but that little cattail branch, we have a trail from our school that was built by a Boy Scout from Greenbelt down to the eroding stream. And
this is cattail branch that goes into the Patuxent is what you're talking about, right?
Goes into the Anacostia River.
Oh, into that cattail branch. Okay.
Over in Glen Arden.
Yes, yes, okay.
So yeah, anybody that wants to just come out and add on to their work.
Yeah, you have my contact information, right? Or can get it from Catherine, right? Well, can you look it up? It's the University of Maryland Geology Department. Yeah, send me an email and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, thank you.
Tom? Tom Taylor, you're muted.
You're still muted.
I'm sorry, I'm not part of the Forest Preserve. I'm with Stormwater, but it sounds like this is a preliminary report. You're continuing to do active studies. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, actually, it's amazing. We are reaching exactly the amount of time that we had planned for.
Yeah.
So
good. I've got to get home.
Yes, we could all thank Karen very much for all the hard work. And I mean, I learned some more today. I personally, I find it a challenge sometimes to keep up, but it's very interesting, and looking forward to the more things you could find.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the next batch of data, which has all the big storms in it. But yeah. And I should point out, you probably saw on the slides that most of the beautiful slides were from Catherine, who taking really useful photos, and anybody else that manages to catch something in action out there, I'd very appreciate getting hold of as well. Thank you.
Oh, and then one more little anecdote is we saw pictures of them actually that Karen mentioned being ghost channels that had recovered from the agricultural era. So actually 2 of those were where we did a big cleanup maybe a couple of years ago, and during COVID, you know, it was a big gully, and people were living in the woods had hidden in those gullies.
Yeah.
So those are the ghost channels.
Fossil gullies are very much favored by the homeless.
Fossil gullies.
Yes, yes, because they kind of create a little bit of a shelter for them to get down, and they realize that they're not going to flood and everything like that. So I've talked to a lot of homeless people when I've been out measuring these features. Yeah.
There have been some homeless folks in that area.
Yeah.
In Greenbelt. Yes.
All right, but thank you very much, Karen, and I think the advisory board meeting will continue with the other things possibly, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.